Hi, this is Sean D'Souza, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation Podcast. This podcast isn't some magic trick about how to work less. Instead, it's about how to really enjoy the work that you do and to enjoy your vacation time. When I first got to New Zealand, I was a cartoonist, not a marketer, and yet I positioned myself as a marketing person, and I had to go to these events every Friday at this networking group called BNI. And the beauty of it was, while you had to pay this fee and you had to pay for breakfast and all of that stuff, it enabled me to learn how to tell stories. Because I had to stand up week after week talking about how I'm a marketing person, and that's plainly boring. People are sitting there having their breakfast. They're not that interested in what you have to say. I mean, they are, but they're not. They always listened when you told them a story. And this podcast, the last in this series of reruns, is about how to craft interesting stories and how to use them for articles, for sales letters, and yes, maybe for networking events as well. My father always told a story of how he drew a kingfisher when he was a boy in school. And every time he told that story, I would roll my eyes and I would groan. I loved the story, but I heard it so many times that the thought of escape always crossed my mind whenever he'd start up that story. When you're writing an article or you're putting an analogy on your sales page, it's very likely that you'd send your reader, your client, into that same groan moment where they start rolling their eyes. Because analogies like learning how to ride a bicycle, how to drive a car, these are very tired analogies. The question is, how do you ditch that analogy? How do you decide when to ditch that analogy? Or better still, how do you improve it so it's not so tired after all? What you're about to hear is a mini podcast. And that's because some of this information is not enough to go across 3 parts, so we just do a mini version of it. And today's podcast is about how to ditch that tired analogy, that analogy that you use when you're writing sales letters or when you're writing your articles. So to begin with, let's take a very everyday event and make an analogy out of it. If you read the book The Brain Audit, there's an analogy of the 7 red bags. The analogy goes like this. It says, imagine you got on a flight and you put 7 red bags on the flight. And then you got off at your airport and you were waiting for your bags. And then 1 bag came out, and the 2nd bag, and then the 3rd. And then there was a purple bag and an orange bag and a green bag. Then the 4th, then the 5th. Then the 6th, and so when do you leave the airport? And this analogy is used to explain what the brain audit is all about, which is that it's about how a client hesitates. Every time one little thing is left behind, how they hesitate. One little piece of information is left behind, they hesitate. But what makes this analogy so interesting? What makes it so captivating is that you've not heard this analogy before. You've not heard about someone standing at the airport waiting for their bags, and so immediately you're drawn into the story. So one of the ways to create a different analogy is just to choose a different situation. Just by merely changing the example, your analogy becomes slightly more interesting. But what if we wanted to make it even more interesting? This is where the power of the personal story comes in. Imagine yourself waiting for the bag. What happens? What happens next? What ups and downs do you go through waiting for those silly old bags? In the brain audit, they aren't just bags, they're red bags. And there aren't just red bags, but 7 red bags. And the story rolls out where one of the bags goes missing. As you can tell, this isn't some kind of tired analogy, but something that's slightly different. You want to know what happens next. You want to know how all of this then reconnects to whatever's being told to you, whatever's being told in the story. So the key to writing better analogies is to write a personal story first. Put yourself at the airport. What did you do? What happened next? And what happened after that? And were there any ups and downs? You remember the purple bag, the green bag, the orange bag? Those are situations where you're creating this level of suspense. What's going to happen next? But it's also creating this little up and down, which is, I got a great bag, I got another red bag, and well, where's the third bag? Where's the fourth bag? I got the sixth bag. Where is the seventh bag? So you're creating this level of suspense, and that's what makes a great story. It's not just, okay, this is the start, this is the end, but that in between where you're waiting, where you're making the client wait for how the story is going to unfold. And clients often ask me, how did you come up with this story, this analogy for the brain audit? And the answer is that I used to go to a networking meeting, and week after week I had to stand up and explain the same concept, which is why clients hesitate, why they buy and why they don't buy. And the only product that I was trying to sell was the brain audit. So week after week I was trying to come up with a different analogy or a different way to say the same thing. And you tend to use the word like. It's like waiting at the airport and you miss one bag, and that's what hesitation is all about. When you're trying to create a story, when you're trying to create this analogy, what you want to do is use the word like, because we use this word like many times in a day. We say, oh, it's like going to the airport and having to go through customs. And then we explain this little story. And this word like helps us make that leap into the story. After that, we've got to embellish the story. We've got to put the ups and downs. We've got to do things that you don't have in the original story. And going to that networking meeting means that I had to tweak it just a little bit week after week, and the story got a little better. However, you might want to start off with just a simple story. Maybe you have just a car story. Maybe you have just a bicycle story. In that case, tell a personal story. And this kind of takes us to our second section, which is how do we tell that mundane story and how do we make it interesting? I learned to ride a bicycle when I was about 8 years old, and only an idiot would learn to ride a bicycle like I did. Most kids would find the safest, flattest area to learn how to cycle, not me. I decided to learn on the slopes filled with red mud. Now, back when I was growing up, the roads where my grandparents lived in Goa, India, were still not paved. They were full of red mud. And I decided, okay, that's where I'm going to learn how to ride my bicycle. Now, that's not a very good place to learn because every time I fell, and I fell a lot, and the combination of the mud and the slopes didn't help at all because I would graze myself badly. But what it did was it gave me a sense of independence. I learned to beat the odds and learned how to ride a bicycle. So what I've just told you here is a personal story. And a personal story is completely different, completely unique because it's your own story. It has its own kind of sequence. Everyone's learned, or almost everyone has learned how to ride a bicycle, but their story is slightly different from your story. And when you tell your story with the drama and the elements that you have in your story, now I'm willing to listen to that bicycle story even though I've heard or I've experienced the bicycle story before. And that's a second way in which you can approach an analogy or a story. The first way might be just riding up elevators, waiting for bags, getting stuck in customs, things that people can relate to. And the second one might be a very commonplace phrase like, imagine learning to ride a bicycle or imagine learning to drive a car. And people go, oh, not that one again. But now you're telling your own story, and that makes a big difference. Which is why a group of friends can talk about how they learned to ride a bicycle, and we would listen to every one of those stories, even though they're almost identical in what happened and how it unfolded. But there is this little personal drama. So I could tell you a story similar to your story, which is when you bought your first computer. Now, my story is slightly different because I had to go to the bank and I had to take a loan to buy the computer, and my father had to stand surety for that loan. It was big drama, and that becomes slightly interesting. We've all bought computers, but now it's slightly more interesting or slightly different. Your own personal story makes a big difference. But what if you don't want to tell a personal story? What if you're, at least for now, a very private person and you go, oh, no, I don't want to talk about my life. I think that my life is boring. Don't worry. All you have to do is substitute one little word, and then you can tell your personal story. So what is that one little word? Let's find out. My personal story was about learning to ride with all the mud and the slopes and stuff. And now you want to tell that story, but you don't want to talk about it as your own personal story. So you turn that personal story into a you analogy instead. You tell that personal story, but you don't use I. In which case the story would run like this. Why would anyone be insane enough to take on the most challenging cycling course? Most people, they take the safest, flattest area to learn how to cycle. But imagine you decided to learn on slopes filled with red mud. Every time you fell, and you do fall a lot, that mud would graze you badly. And of course, learning on a slope means that you're tempting gravity all the time. Yet, pushing these boundaries gives you a sense of challenge, gives you a sense of independence. And after all of these years, that bike riding incident has stayed with you. Now, notice how the analogy isn't tired. It isn't personal, because you're not saying I, you're saying you. However, it still seems like an interesting analogy. And it's likely that you've read The Brain Audit. You've read it at least a couple of times. I recommend that you read it thrice. But what you might not have noticed when you were reading The Brain Audit was how many analogies and stories there are in those 180 pages. Within those pages, an analogy or a story comes up with such high frequency that you wonder, well, how am I going to get all these analogies and stories? And you will find that a lot of these stories and a lot of these analogies are things that you experience anyway in your life, but the way they are told, by using that you factor or the I factor, which is the personal story, or something that happens to us every day. Like, there's one story about dog poo, how you step in dog poo. Well, that happens to us every day. We get a cop car that has its red and blue flashing lights. That happens to us every day. So all of these elements of everyday situations or stories that are personal stories or you analogies, they all help to make this very interesting flow for the book. Because what happens when you're writing a sales page is that there's a lot of information. And the same thing applies to when you're writing an article. Obviously, the article is giving new information. That gets the reader tired. They need some level of entertainment, and a story, an analogy, it helps break that pace. It slows them down. It gives some white space, but it also entertains. Now, if that entertainment factor is boring, well, now you've lost the reader. And you already know this. You already know the fact that people need that kind of break. They need examples to even understand what you're saying. And when you put that in, you have a much easier flowing piece of information. However, the problem has always been, how do I get those analogies? And now you kind of know how to get those analogies. Which kind of brings us to the end of this podcast. So let's summarize what we've learned so far. If you're ever reaching for a tired analogy, the first recourse would be to find something that's unusual, like the 7 red bag story. Now, it's a pretty usual story in the sense that we've all been at the airport, or most of us have, and we've waited for our bags. We've just added a little drama to it, which is that it's now a set of red bags and it's 7 red bags, and then there is this suspense of the orange bag and the purple bag. So that kind of slows things down. And you kind of know how it ends, but then right at the end, there's a twist. Now, the difference between the story and the analogy is that the analogy has this factor of like. You say, it's like being stuck in customs. It's like waiting for your bags. It's like going to the supermarket. So using the like straight away puts it into that analogy basket. And that was the first thing that we covered. But what was the second thing? The second thing was telling your personal stories. You going to the supermarket is an interesting story if you have just a tiny little twist in it. You have to tell your story. If you buy a computer, that's your story. However, and this takes us to the third part, what if you don't want to tell your story? What if you don't want to say I? Well, you just say you. Imagine you went to the supermarket. Imagine there was a big queue and you wanted to jump the queue. You've made a very small tweak there and you've managed to tell your personal story, but with the you in between. And these are 3 quick ways in which you can create analogies and stories in your sales letters, in your articles. And if you've attended any of our presentations or you've read the books or you've seen a webinar, you'll have noticed that there are lots of these stories, lots of these analogies. People often say, what makes a psychotactics book or a psychotactics course so interesting? Or for instance, this podcast. And what we have are lots of these little analogies and examples that keep popping up on a frequent basis. And this is what most of us like, no matter what book we're reading, especially information-based books, because we need to kind of wind down a bit and we need these examples. Good marketers and good storytellers know the power of story and analogy. So they use it very effectively to drive home several points throughout their marketing, throughout their editorial material. And they mix it up a lot with analogies, with stories, while the amateurs are simply writing yucky, boring stuff. Tired analogies are for lazy writers. Don't be sloppy, don't be boring. Put in the power of story in your analogy. And you'll notice how your readers not only follow along, but they remember your story and your analogy long after they've finished reading whatever you've written. So what's the one thing that you can do today? The one thing that you can do today is work out what analogy you're going to talk about. You're going to take a walk, you're going to go to the supermarket, you're going to buy some bread, you're going to do something which is extremely mundane, but you're going to do it in a different way. So for instance, when we go for a coffee and we step into a cafe that we've never been to before, Renuka and I have certain parameters that enable us to decide whether we're going to go ahead with the coffee or not. So the first thing we'll look at is the barista. How is the barista dressed? How are they in terms of neatness? Because usually we found that if they're not neat, then the coffee is not good. That's the first step. The second step is that we look at the art on the coffee and we decide, well, is the art good or is it sloppy? If it's sloppy, then usually the barista is not very competent and the art is kind of the final layer on top of it, and the coffee is not usually good. And sometimes we could be wrong because they could fail on neatness and they could fail on the art and the coffee could still be pretty decent or even very good. What I've just told you there is our system of choosing a cafe, choosing to go to a strange cafe. And you're going to have all of these little systems. So if I was standing in front of an audience and I was talking to them about, say, the brain audit, then I would say, this book is like an audit. And what we do is a coffee audit. And that's what a client does with you as well. They do it so quickly that you don't realize what's happening, but they're going through an audit. And this book, The Brain Audit, shows you how to do that audit, how to recognize the elements in that audit. So what I've done here is taken a very simple system, and that's the one thing that you can do today. Look at the times when you're saying like, and then write that down, or look at the things that you're already doing, the mundane things, and look at how you can make that slightly different, slightly more interesting. And that brings us to the end of this podcast. Let's find out what's happening in Psychotactics land. Well, three things, really. The first is the 25th of Jan, the info products course that is at psychotactics.com/info goodies. Then there's the article writing course, which the sign up is in March. And when I say sign up, it's because there is a live course which is being conducted on a forum online with me overlooking your every action for 3 months. It's pretty intense. It's so full on that it's called the toughest writing course in the world. And you'll find out why if you choose to be part of the article writing experience. And it's quite an experience for 3 months. So you have to go to psychotactics.com/AW goodies. That puts you on the waiting list, and that gives you the notification when we are launching the course. The first preference is for 5000 BC members, and we only take 25 people on the course, and again 25 people for the home study or the self-study. So there are limited seats on both courses, and that's why you have to be on the waiting list. Go to psychotactics.com/AW, that stands for article writing. So AW goodies, and you get on the waiting list, you get the goodies. And you're now waiting for March when this sale goes out. Other than that, you know where you can find 5000 BC. It's at 5000bc.com. It's a very cool place to be in. Not only because you get answers, you get a lot of answers, but because I ask you specific questions. The ability to ask questions, to ask pointed questions is what I'm good at. Yeah, I know, patting myself on the back, but I'm really good at it. And that enables you to think and come back, and then we have this ongoing discussion. You get articles written for you based on your specific problem. I don't think there's such a unique deal anywhere on the internet. There are lots of places you can go to, but you'll find 5000 BC to be very special. So let's see you in 5000bc.com. Oh yeah, and it also gives you first preference to all of these courses. So yeah, that's a big advantage. And with that, we finish our reruns. From the next week on, we're back to new episodes. Bye for now.